warm welcome to the second of our Chartered Institute of Building conversations on global approaches to green building, climate change and sustainability, a dialogue on policy. This event is being recorded. Now, climate change, one of the most significant and misunderstood risks organisations and governments face today. These debates need to be accessible to all, especially the public. My name is Kye Bangbola. I'm a fellow and ambassador of the Chartered Institute of Building, and it is my great pleasure to be your moderator for the webinar. I have been part of this great institution nearly 35 years, and I'm pleased to say I've met a lot of great members along the way. Do you know, the first time the world received scientific evidence of climate change was in 1968. True story. Now, I have a fantastic job. I run a sustainability management and training consultancy called Total Eco Management. I am a published author of 2 books on corporate sustainability. I work with national and multinational enterprises across the globe, honing their processes to measure, manage, change, and transparently report their sustainability performance. This is about enabling business to be profitable and contribute to sustainable global economies. Total Eco Management were the official corporate sustainability reporting consultant to the London 2012 Sustainable Olympic Games. Now, before that, I ran the largest green building programme in the country, capital spend 200 million a year on the country's only 14,001 municipal development programme at that time. The CIOB has over 45,000 members in over 100 countries. It has represented the industry for nearly 190 years. It is the international voice of the construction and property professional, representing an unequalled body of knowledge concerning the management of the total building process. This, of course, is our mandate to be here in a discussion about global policy. To be clear, what's at stake? If we become sustainable, we all win. If we remain unsustainable, we all lose. And this brings me neatly to our chat today. Next slide, please. As you can see, we have 3 great speakers for you. Each will give a 10-minute presentation, then there will be a 15-minute moderator-led discussion, and then we will conclude with a Q&A, after which I will call our webinar to a close. The Q&A consists of pre-submitted questions, but you can also ask questions at the chat using the Q&A button. All questions will be answered, and those that we do not get round to in the time available, they will be answered after the webinar. To our members and interested professionals from across the globe, Singapore, South Africa, Britain, America, we are really pleased that you could join us today. And may I extend a further warm welcome to Caroline Gumbel, our Chartered Institute of Building Chief Executive, and also to other directors of institutions who have joined us for this webinar. May I now ask Caroline Gumbel to say a special hello to all of our guests. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Kye. Thank you. Welcome to part 2 of our very first CIOB conversation events, where we will bring together global thought leaders to discuss policy and practical application of policy across a number of areas. CIOB does have over 45,000 members worldwide. We are therefore in an excellent position to bring together our members and partner organisations across the globe to discuss important issues facing our industry. Today, we are particularly pleased to have representation from Qatar, South Africa, London, United States Green Building Councils as panelists on our 2 sessions. CIOB Conversations will be a series of events drawing upon CIOB's policy positions that covers ethics, quality, the future of construction, education and skills, and the economic and social impact of the industry. I'm very much looking forward to what our panelists have to say today, and also what questions you, the audience, may have. So it's with great pleasure I now hand back to our moderator, Kye, to take us through the session. Thank you, Kye.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I appreciate that, and I will continue on. You see, this is an unusual situation as we learn to navigate the new normal of our respective countries in a post-COVID-19 landscape impacted by Black Lives Matters and climate change. Next slide, please. Thank you, you're already on. Anyone tweeting today can do so at #CIOBPD. Facebook Live is streaming and our website is www.ciob.org.uk. The picture here is one of those great members that I mentioned, Alan Crane, past president of the CIOB, and I. In 2010, we developed CIOB Carbon Action 2050. Working with government and industry, we provided the 50 practical actions any built environment professional could do to secure the planet. These covered leadership, design, construction, maintenance, retrofit, skills, logistics across new, existing buildings and public realm. Sadly, the issues that we acted to crack then by transforming the industry remain the same now. The mega project of the Olympic Games practiced what Carbon Action 2050 preached and was very, very successful. The crisis is now much worse, as Nicholas Stern predicted, requiring us to go even faster to meet climate change targets of net zero emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. We are at the beginning of the world's first predictable industrial revolution to deal with the crisis we face, created by policies and laws of the past. But we can change that. We really can change that by galvanizing government and industry, channeling $2.4 trillion per annum of investment into green sustainable organizations that are taking the actions to stay within 1.5 degrees. And of course, divesting from red stream organisations that you can see on the graph. Next slide, please. Despite struggling economies, respective countries are pursuing Green New Deals. The CIOB's policy position on sustainability and climate change is to support organisations to decarbonise, drive innovation, competition, create opportunities for savings, and create new jobs. Our mission members, our mission is to respond to our real issues that are already bringing death to the planet. Climate change, temperature rise, resource use, water, waste, pollution, wealth distribution, population, green transportation, digital transfer. These issues shape the towns and cities in which we live and work. So, no pressure. Let's talk about green built environmental policy that leaves no one behind and contributes to UN Sustainable Development Goals. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, John Alker, Director of Policy at the UK Green Building Council. John leads a growing programme of activities on cities and place. He is responsible for advancing net zero cities and value programmes. I feel sure we look forward to hearing how that's working out for you, John. My friend, over to you.
Thank you, Kye. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great stuff. Well, I probably won't take my full 10 minutes. I'm really keen to hear what my colleagues say as well, particularly keen to hear from Elizabeth and the transition to a new presidency. But it is pretty interesting time in the UK as well, politically, and in terms of our context or our position in the world, particularly Europe. But as you probably know, the UK holds the COP presidency this year, and we look forward to welcoming the world. Well, we hope, right? We look forward to welcoming the world to Glasgow in 2021. We also hope that Glasgow will remain part of the UK by that point. That's another story. So it really interesting from a UK kind of perspective, and really timely to be having this conversation. Literally just in the last few days, the UK has committed, in the jargon, it's NDC, it's nationally determined contribution, as a result of the Paris Agreement, a 68% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 on 1990 levels, which to be honest is a really serious level of ambition. I think it's to be really welcomed, and so that is all heading towards our 2050 net zero carbon target, which is enshrined in UK law. I mean, the government is very fond of telling people around the world that of course we have this policy architecture in place with set carbon budgets and the advice of the Committee on Climate Change in the UK. But it is true, it is a system that is working. And we've got some way to go to get on track for some of our future carbon budget, but that's the point. And we've got really kind of robust independent advice from our Committee on Climate Change, which just yesterday, or was it earlier today? I'm losing count of the days this week, but just in literally the last 48 hours issued its next kind of swathe of advice to the government on the pathway to net zero carbon across the whole economy, and released its new modelling on costing and so on. So it's a really timely point to have this conversation. We're definitely world beaters in setting targets. I'm not sure we're necessarily world beaters in always following through in terms of the policy and practice that will enable us to meet those targets. So I think that could be part of the conversation. But I think that sentiment from government is incredibly important in terms of the message it sends to the market. I think that over the last 5 years or so, there have been wobbles in terms of the message that government has sent and certain key policies that have kind of come and gone, and that has been incredibly sort of detrimental to market confidence in the built environment sector and more widely. But I think something has kind of changed over the last couple of years, and we're now the kind of voices, the sort of fringe voices, really are that they are kind of a minority in the UK. There is significant cross-party consensus around the need to act on climate and indeed on wider sustainability issues, particularly nature and biodiversity decline. And I think in large part, a lot of that is also to do with the popular movement, the youth movement around climate action, I mean, who could really have predicted if we were kind of having this conversation in 2016, 2017? I think the sort of momentum that has built up around the world for climate action across kind of 2018, 19, it's been absolutely phenomenal, and almost equally phenomenal to see how that has maintained throughout 2020, despite the very obvious crisis that we find ourselves in globally. In fact, kind of doubling down in a way, and how the kind of green recovery narrative has really gone mainstream. Certainly in the UK, I'll be interested in picking up on that elsewhere. I think just briefly kind of just flagging a few sort of key policy issues, because a lot of that is sort of very positive. And certainly kind of the net zero concept has absolutely taken, I think, the UK kind of built it, or at least the kind of mainstream built environment market, by storm, really. It is just sort of not credible anymore for certainly kind of publicly listed businesses, not to have a robust sustainability strategy. But despite all of that, actually emissions reductions from buildings in the UK have stalled in the last couple of years. And certainly kind of one of the reasons for that, I think, is that policy is not sort of bearing down hard enough in certain kind of sort of difficult to reach areas. And retrofit is particularly difficult. Retrofit of non-domestic buildings is hard enough, but getting to the 26 million individual residential properties in the UK is a long-standing problem, that requires effectively kind of intervention, regulation, in people's lives, and I think successive governments have found that difficult. So happy to kind of debate those issues. I think that there are, just to flag a few other kind of possible talking points. I think we've got a pretty good sense now of what green building, what net zero carbon building looks like. It's really now how we do it, and that's often a kind of financial consideration, and what the kind of typical model of investment and development is, perhaps what the kind of level of community involvement and ownership looks like. So I think those are really interesting questions, and I think there's a lively conversation in the UK about the role of central and local government. I realise that'll be different elsewhere, but there's a bit of sort of healthy tension, I would say. And real leadership being shown by our cities and regions, and whether or not they've got the kind of right resources and powers to do that is an open question. And finally, I mean, I touched on it a little bit in terms of green recovery, but big focus on inequalities in the UK, and the concept of a just transition to a net zero carbon economy, and who the kind of winners and losers are, and how we mitigate the kind of unintended consequences of that. There's a big kind of debate around the north-south divide in the UK that has been exacerbated because of COVID. So yeah, just a few things I'd be very happy to chat about further later on.
Thank you very much for that, John. Everyone hearing me okay? And it's really good to hear about some of the city and regional leadership that you've described. Now, our next speaker is Elizabeth Beardsley, Senior Policy Counsel for the United States Green Building Council. For more than 20 years, Elizabeth has worked on environmental and climate issues, both as an engineer and as a lawyer. She provides strategic green building law and policy guidance and direction across the international, federal, state and local spectrum. Elizabeth's work focuses on connecting building policy to climate mitigation. Welcome, Elizabeth, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Kye, and thank you to CIOB for hosting this discussion today. I'm also really grateful for the opportunity to participate and hear from my fellow panelists and get into the discussion. I know everyone wants to hear about what's going on in the crazy US, so let me get to it. We're at a climate tipping point, not just in terms of science and our ability to control the impacts of temperature change, but we now have 2/3 of the American public feeling those impacts at a local level and supporting government action. So that's key. and the intersection of climate change with the global pandemic, the economic recession we find ourselves in, and social stresses all have implications for these actions. We've seen how better building design, construction, and operation can boost economies, can improve health and well-being, and increase efficiency across the country. So now it's time to scale up these efforts and get them in place across the country to create better quality of life for everyone. So first, election. You may have noticed we had an election. We're excited to have President-elect Biden stating first off that we will be rejoining the Paris Agreement. I was very lucky to be in Paris 5 years ago, and we've joined with many states and business entities across the US in the We Are Still In movement to try to show the international community that despite our now outgoing president, that we are still engaged in this effort and want to meet our commitments. So this is great that we'll be formally rejoining the agreement, because we know that only gets us part of the way there, and we really need to do much more to avert the climate crisis. President-elect Biden has climate as one of his top priorities, along with COVID, recovery, economy, and equity. So those are the 4 pillars that he's starting with on day one. In terms of the congressional election, we have the same party, the Democratic Party, holding the majority in the House, but it's a very slim majority. And in the Senate, due to quirks that might seem odd to others from other countries, that our state elections are, the state election laws determine the rules of how a state elects its own congressional representatives. So there are now 2 runoff elections in Georgia to determine the senators from that state. No one senator candidate got enough proportion of the votes to win outright. So we have these runoffs in early January. And the determination of what party will control the Senate is going to be based on the outcomes of those elections. So there's this uncertainty lingering right now. And I'll just say that isn't determinative of policy in the next Congress, but it is important because the majority leader will determine what bills get time on the floor and can get votes, and the committees determine the hearings and agendas. So it certainly plays a large role. But either way, there is, I think, room for hope regardless, and some common ground. So President Biden had released detailed plans on a number of core topics, including clean energy, and his plan is bold in setting out in terms of including building targets. So, for example, reducing the carbon footprint of the US building stock 50% by 2035, upgrading 4 million buildings, and weatherizing 2 million homes over 4 years, which would create at least 1 million good-paying jobs, and to spur the construction of 1.5 million sustainable homes and housing units. And along with that, as I mentioned, equity is rightfully going to be an integral consideration. So it won't be just sort of after the fact looking at impacts, but really integrated into policies to make it fair and to ensure that those who are at disadvantage are the ones benefiting. In terms of Congress, the House of Representatives has been playing a key role in elevating the climate discussion in the US at a national level. Hearings, reports, recommendations, and bills, House committees have put forth a number of proposals to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And buildings are showing up in these policy proposals, which we're really excited about, as they must be, since they represent about 1/3 of the US energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. There are bills like the LIFT Act that would invest in efficiency in public buildings and schools. We have another one, the Moving Forward Act, that also passed the House this year, but was not taken up in the Senate, that had funding for highly efficient green schools construction, investing in low-income housing, tax incentives for efficiency, funding for energy upgrades for public buildings, and like policies across the board. So as far as the outlook, we at USGBC have been advocating for priority action in 5 key areas to provide an immediate jobs boost as well as long-term benefits for climate and the environment and building occupants. Schools, federal buildings, critical facilities, private sector incentives, and housing. We're now at a point where we know how to build net zero energy, low and zero carbon buildings, but we need to scale the improvements. We've shown buildings can be a solution for climate, environment, and health, but we can't just have a few percent of buildings perform this way. We need 70, 80, 90% of buildings to move in that direction. The House, several key reports and a draft discussion bill that came out of the House, as well as the Biden plan, all commit to achieve a net zero economy-wide by 2050, and call for incentives for states on things like building codes and investing in energy efficiency in various ways. Implementing energy and water efficiency and green building strategies, from green roofs to refrigerant management and building integration, especially if accompanied by federal funding, can help create construction jobs and restore losses that we've seen in the energy efficiency job sector. And this is what will be really important to getting support across the political spectrum. I think we'll see a stimulus bill next year that invests in infrastructure to create jobs and restore the economy, and that the tone of that infrastructure bill will direct funding in ways to reduce buildings' contribution to greenhouse gases and to provide more equity. And these are the connections we're emphasizing. Policy proposals are also starting to include net zero requirements for public buildings and incentives for net zero private sector buildings. We're seeing discussion of embodied carbon as a policy tool in terms of materials. Building grid integration is another main area to reduce the total footprint of buildings, and also workforce and the need to invest and expand our clean energy and energy efficiency workforce. So
you've just gone to mute, Elizabeth.
I've got a dog barking problem. I'm so sorry. So that actually was the conclusion of my formal remarks. So I'm going to stop there and get into the discussion after our third panelist. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Your doggy's obviously into green building, and that's good.
And squirrels.
Lovely. Well, thank you for that. They were some very strong points in terms of upgrades of buildings for jobs, policies to lift communities and help them thrive. And essentially that includes all those public buildings. I think that's where it's at in many ways, looking to the future, making sure that we have a good built environment. Now, our final speaker is Marlos Reining, founder of Solid Green Consulting in South Africa. Through her architectural background, Marlos specialises in sustainable buildings and green building certification, including Green Star. She is part of the development of a tool for retail, public and educational buildings, which she might cover in her talk. Marlos, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Kye, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel and to tell you a little bit more about what's happening in South Africa. I'm going to take a slightly more practical approach than the previous two speakers, but I'm sure it will all blend in nicely. Next slide. Just briefly, Solid Green Consulting. I started it 10 years ago. We're celebrating our 10th year anniversary with 100 certifications this month, so we're pretty proud of that. Next slide. And but basically the leading green building consultancy in South Africa. And in South Africa, the green building industry really started with the creation of the Green Building Council in 2008 and the Green Star system. We were the 13th GBCSA that started globally, after which many more followed. And GBCSA is not only active in South Africa, it's also active throughout Africa in countries like Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, and Mauritius, Nigeria, where they're active and trying to promote green buildings as well. Next slide. So it's quite interesting from a publication point of view that South Africa is, by this study, and the same study was done in 2016 and 18, that South Africa has one of the fastest growing green building industry, and I really feel like we have to catch up with the rest of the world because there's still so much work to be done on the green building field. But this study showed that green buildings are already established in South Africa, and people were saying that 41% of their work is currently green, which I think is a bit of an overstatement, but it's nevertheless good promotion for South Africa. And interestingly, some of the triggers for green buildings was lower operating cost and healthier buildings and doing the right thing, which is probably not what you would expect. You would probably expect that legislation and policies are driving green buildings, but it seems like in South Africa there's a much more voluntary drive for green buildings. Next slide. So in the last 12 years, totally in South Africa, there's been 600 buildings certified, and net zero certifications are starting to come up in the last 3 years. Next slide. So with the whole drive towards advancing net zero, and the previous speakers were also alluding to this, the commitment to creating all new buildings to be net zero by 2030 and all existing buildings, or all buildings by 2050. South Africa is also one of the green building councils that has committed to this, and so this is also starting to develop in South Africa. Next slide. And the 4 major cities in South Africa have signed up to this commitment as well, and this is just because national policy and regulations are quite slow, and so the cities have decided to take action in hand and come up through this program and through the C40s program, come up with their own bylaws and green building policies to encourage people and developers to take green buildings more serious, and the drive to net zero buildings in the cities. And these are the 4 major cities in South Africa: Joburg, City of Tshwane, eThekwini, and Cape Town. Next slide. And the GBCSA followed with some certification options for developers to demonstrate their commitment to net zero. So we, besides net zero carbon, we also have certifications for net zero water and waste and ecology, which is probably quite unique to South African situation. Next slide. And then really where, wanted to briefly touch about net zero in energy and in reality and how we're implementing it in South Africa. Next slide. So we're currently working on a couple of projects, and there's many more in the pipeline, but these are sort of the certified projects, and the different types of projects as well. And it's the nice thing of the net zero approach is it can be applied to office buildings, residential buildings, and hotels that you can see in these slides. Some of these projects are also targeting Living Building Challenge, which sets the bar even higher to go towards net positive. So next slide. So through these projects, what we've realized is a couple of things that need to start happening to create better net zero buildings and movement towards low carbon buildings is really changing our mindset in terms of design and integrated design, and making sustainable building part of the puzzle and not seeing it as an add-on to your normal designs. Next slide. And really changing our mindset. We have an amazing climate in South Africa where usually 60% of the time of the year we don't really need any air conditioning, and 60% of the year we have perfect weather conditions to just flush the building with fresh air, and we just need to make sure that we're designing with that in mind. Next slide. And really aligning with our climate. What we see a lot in the design trends here in South Africa is that we are building all these glass buildings, which are like, glass is sexy, and we got all these ideas from Europe, but most designers don't realize that the intensity of the sun in Africa is slightly higher than in Europe, and so you have to deal with all the, the increased intensities coming into the building. So really, like, changing our mindset towards designing according to the climate that we're in. Next slide. And really unlocking the sun. You can click through these. And at the moment we use renewables, but it can be much bigger. And to be able to unlock the sun, there need to be a couple of barriers that we need to remove. And next slide. And one of them is definitely legislation, because currently in South Africa we're not allowed to feed back into the grid, and certain projects we are allowed to feed back into the grid, but not more than what we're using. In Johannesburg, we don't know what's happening with feeding back into the grid, and in Pretoria the feed-in tariffs are so low that it doesn't financially make any sense to feed back into the grid. So legislation is an important part of it. But then, having said that, there is a lot of change happening in South Africa regarding legislation, and there's much more pressure from society to get the legislation changed. So even though it's an issue now, I think in 2 years' time you'll hear me saying something completely different. Next slide. And then in terms of finances on projects, we really, if we start talking about net zero, coming up with a more innovative way of looking at financing our projects, and finding these professionals that are able to think a little bit broader than just the conventional way of building, and thinking more about life cycle analysis and other innovative financing structures to start financing these projects. And I think that was my last slide. Next slide. All right, and then in order to remove these barriers, what we're trying to do, and we're obviously promoting this a lot in South Africa, is like whatever projects we're doing is demonstrating that it can be done, and that people are, like, enthusiastic about the projects in trying to create a net zero movement. And also with advocacy, like talking to the municipalities and finding the right people to drive change within the industry. And I'm trying to do this through our Living Future Collaborative in South Africa that we started, and really driving and trying to spread the message, and then as well, like educating people, educating that it doesn't have to be more expensive to go net zero, and really empowering people to be able to talk more about green buildings and net zero. And we're doing that through our online education platform, Green Ed. Next slide. Yeah, and that was. I hope I gave you a bit of an overview of what's happening in South Africa. We obviously, like what the other two speakers were alluding to as well, like inequality, and we have probably more inequality than in the US and the UK, where we actually have two dual economies, with on the one side like the very high end and rich population, and on the other side like a lot of poor people in South Africa. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you very much, Marlis. Like net positive, and also you touched upon those issues of legislation and change. So as we now move into the moderator-led discussion, you can keep your speakers on unmute and respond to the various points that I raise. Now, I'm sure that our audience would like to know how you respond as practitioners in the field to the question, do you think that governments are doing enough to achieve net zero in construction by 2050 in not only your home countries, but maybe if you know more about other places around the world? So do you think governments are doing enough to achieve net zero in construction by 2050? I'd like to know and tell our audience what you think, and any examples or things that you think governments should be doing. So over to you.
Was it a question for me?
Who are we starting with, Kye? Is it for all of us?
Anyone can start as they choose. So let's start with Marlowe's.
Great. Obviously, governments are never doing enough, in my opinion, but it's unfair to say, obviously, because I mean, especially in a country like South Africa, we have so many more pressing issues. So what we've seen, and what I was demonstrating in my slides as well, here it's a voluntary movement, and it seems like, you know, the mindsets of corporates are changing to doing the right thing and changing towards more efficient buildings, and also on the, you know, the reporting on the ESG goals for most companies becomes more and more important, and that will force them to look more at their portfolios and their buildings as well. So, I mean, I would love to see the government doing more things, but I don't think we can expect here in South Africa to do them more. And it's for us already encouraging to see that the municipalities are picking it up and driving change through legislation and policy.
Okay, John, do you have a view?
Big question, whether governments are doing enough.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I can only really speak to the UK and to an extent Europe, and I think the answer in the UK is no, but I think that there is an acknowledgement, at least an acknowledgement of that, and there is a kind of semblance of a plan to address that. So I'm kind of glass half full in that respect. I think we've seen some really ambitious, kind of aggressive, in a good way, you know, policy coming through from Europe that the UK is sadly, in my personal view, is no longer relevant. But you know, we're seeing some really radical policy coming through from the European Parliament and the Commission in terms of concept of circular economy, you know, for example, you know, really quite far-reaching stuff. So I'd be optimistic, taking a slightly wider regional view.
Thank you
Yeah, I'll
very
just
much.
say, I think if the benchmark should be the 1.5 degree report from the UNFCCC, then developed countries should be doubling our rate of deep energy retrofit, and we're not there yet. And we're also, you know, that report called for all new construction to be net zero this year, 2020. We're not there yet either. So, you know, if that's what we have to do to control warming, we're not doing enough yet. There are signs of hope, but we really have to get out of the gate here and get that to be more the normal way things are done rather than the extraordinary. We have in the US, some of the sort of picking up on what John was saying earlier, we have some cities who are being really progressive in coming up with some policy solutions. So we have maybe a half dozen building performance policies now, and that's a little bit new for the US. So these require buildings to meet either a specific energy use intensity based on the building type, or a carbon emission intensity, and over time. So New York City is probably, I think, was the first and is the most well-known, and that's still it's in the early stages of implementation. But that's one movement that we're seeing. I think, as I mentioned, I mostly focus on the federal outlook, because I think we're going to need money in the form of grants for states and local government, and as well as directly to building owners to try to get those retrofits going at a much greater level and a deeper level of retrofit.
Thank you very much for that. Now, another question, and you don't have to answer these questions, but just feel free if you feel that you have something on the subject. So in the UK, the government recently announced large companies, PLCs, must report and disclose the financial risk posed by climate change to their business. Companies that fail to disclose may become uninvestable and uninsurable. Panel, do you think that other countries will begin to adopt such corporate reporting standards, and why? And I know Marlos touched a bit on this in terms of environmental social governance reporting. So may I start with you, Marlos?
I hope that such legislation comes through to South Africa, but and it would be great, but I don't think that would very soon happening. What companies need to report on here, and that's fairly new legislation, is the carbon tax, which I assume has been implemented in the US and UK already, but that's a new thing in South Africa, and hopefully that will, you know, be broadened towards other reporting structures as well. But most larger companies only have to report on their ESGs, which is also starting to grow much bigger these days.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in, or I will go to...
I like a question for non-UK folk.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I think we have we had a climate risk task force that made recommendations for what should be included in certain disclosures that are made to our Securities and Exchange Commission reports, and so those are out there and are getting a lot more attention. And there's also potentially our Federal Reserve Bank, which regulates other banks, is looking at potential requirements for including climate risk in stress tests that other lenders have to undertake. So that will basically force financial institutions in the US to look at their portfolio and what the climate vulnerability there, and that will in turn, I think, lead to divestment from fossil fuels as a long-term losing investment. So there's like some of these, I think, to the new incoming Biden administration will be looking at like all the tools available and how to put them into play.
Great. Now I've got a lovely, very practical one in terms of the people that live with our buildings. You see, poor quality is costing the industry annually more than its combined profits, according to the Chartered Institute of Building Academy. So I was going to ask, what kinds of policies and regulations might be positioned to drive quality, the quality of work that's being carried out, and to aid that user satisfaction? Over to you. Anyone come in? John, would you like to come in first?
I was trying to answer one of the questions in the chat, and I totally blanked what you were saying. I'm trying to. I'm a bloke. I can't do two things at once.
Don't worry. I'll say the question again. The poor quality is costing the industry annually more than its combined profits, according to the Chartered Institute of Building Academy. What policies / regulations might be positioned to drive quality in the work that is carried out, and to also, very, very importantly, aid satisfaction for customers?
Okay, well, I'll have a quick pop at this. I'm sure there are many different ways of answering it, but I'm a very big fan of transparency and data on real performance. I think it's remarkable that we probably make the largest investments of our lives in terms of, for example, the purchasing of and mortgaging of our homes, having visited a house maybe a couple of times and having very, very poor information on how that property actually performs. And you might get a survey done, but what are the energy bills? You know, what's the air quality, etc., etc. And you compare that to going and buying a household appliance, and you can go on any internet site in the world, you know, and get star ratings and millions of reviews. You know exactly how it performs. I mean, it's crazy when you just think about that kind of that dichotomy. So I think that we should be absolutely enforcing far better monitoring and reporting on real performance and sampling percentages of properties in developments through, you know, a period of years after their occupation, and then forcing those responsible to make up for any gap in performance and defects.
Thank you. Any other views?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because certainly in terms of energy performance of homes, like that's really a big issue. And I feel like Europe has the most experience with some of the labeling types of approaches. We have a couple cities here that do that, and our Federal Department of Energy has some tools that they're trying to promote as far as identifying relative energy efficiency of a home for purchasers. So I think we'll see more on that, because it does go to the bottom line as well as to comfort and health aspects too, if we tie in indoor air quality. And I think that the pandemic has certainly gotten people to think more about the quality of the spaces, the buildings that they spend time in, both at home. We're all at home all the time right now, but then also offices and kind of being more mindful. So even though all of us on this webinar are, it's very natural for us to see those connections, but I don't think necessarily the average public thinks that way. So I think that increased awareness could lead to better support for some of that kind of information that helps reinforce long-term quality.
Lovely. And Marlos, do you have a view?
Yeah, I guess in South Africa we definitely live more outside than in Europe and in the US. So there is a lot more ventilation, and houses are definitely more leaky than what they are in Europe. And I think so from that perspective, our residential market probably feels much healthier than in Europe. But what I've seen happening after COVID, which is a really good thing, is that there is a much bigger focus on health and safety and health, and going back to the office and what needs to be changed within the office to create safer spaces for people to work and for people to feel safe when they are at work, and not being contaminated. So there have been a lot of documents coming out from the Green Building Council with a list of things that you can do, not a certification system, but like a guideline as to how to change your space to be COVID friendly. And from that perspective, the pandemic was a bit of a incentivizer to look at these things that we all know that are so important, and give it much more emphasis. And for us, it's great because it makes the whole green building scene much more exciting. Except for just looking at energy efficiency, we now get to address a whole bunch of other issues within buildings as well. Much more of the social side and the productivity side of people. Yeah, and COVID has just given us that incentive to put way more emphasis on that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm sure the world is hearing that the building industry, people working in the built environment, are more than happy to do more in terms of pushing forward the net zero by whichever time frame, 2030, 2050. There is a sense that we could do more, and that's a powerful message to government to come and work with us to galvanise themselves with sectors and industry so that we can achieve the targets that are being set. Now we're on to the Q&A. So this is my opportunity to reintroduce our panel members. So we have Marlos Reining, Elizabeth Beardsley and John Alker. And our virtual format today enables our audience to submit pre-submitted questions. So I'll start with one of these. And of course, remembering audience, you can also ask questions in the chat and the Q&A. So get your fingers tapping and let's go with the first question that's come in this final period for the Q&A of our webinar. Now, the question was asked, how can we utilise our natural resources in Africa and build green buildings that are sustainable with natural ventilation and comfort? And I think you touched upon this as well, Marlos. And they want to ensure that it's without the aid of mechanical ventilation. The questioner notes that in cold weather countries, we insulate and ensure airtight heating systems are adequate. What can we do in Africa? What can we do with our internal environment for it to be comfortable for us to live in without the aid of mechanical ventilation?
Well, I can give you a lecture on that for an hour. It's not an easy question to answer. But I think that, and what I was stressing in my presentation as well, we need to go back to basic and look and learn from architecture that has been building in South Africa and Africa for the last year, and learning from those experiences and not looking at economies where like those type of buildings are totally inappropriate for the climate that we're in. And for our climate, Joburg, perfect climate, you don't need air conditioning if you design your building well and make sure that you have, your simple things, overhangs, shading devices to keep the sun out as opposed to inviting it in. And you can create a very good, comfortable building. And then look, if you want to look at alternative air conditioning systems, splitting the ventilation from the cooling system would be already a really good thing. And then looking at more alternative cooling systems like radiant ceilings, which are much more passive than the conventional ceiling. So that's in short. But as I said, like I can talk about this topic for hours if I want to.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Marlos. And I've got another question here that's in the chat. It says, I'm involved in the development of a new community in Canada for approximately 80,000 people. Are there any examples of effective sustainability policies currently being implemented in the UK?
That was the question I tried to answer. Oh, sorry.
Perfect, John.
I had to do that in writing. But,
this is ideal for you.
Yeah. Sorry, I was multitasking. But I mean, what I said was I'm not sure there's anything particularly world-beating that I would be advocating that the UK has cracked that nowhere else has cracked. But I did flag that I think one of the issues that we absolutely need to get to grips with is embodied carbon in material choices, and not just in construction, but obviously particularly in construction, but over the course of the whole life cycle of buildings. And I don't know about other countries, but it's only now really that local codes are beginning to explore this issue. There's nothing really in national policy. But I think there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be starting to target not just monitoring and reporting of that issue, but also real reductions compared to kind of on business as usual type benchmarks.
Thank you very much. And does anyone else have anything to say about that question?
I can just recommend to have a look at the Living Community Challenge, designed by a Canadian, so quite appropriate for the project that she's talking about. But that I mean, it's a rating system, rating tool, but it sets these goals and it has a lot of inspiration in there. So it's not like a tick boxing exercise, but it's really inspirational to have a look at. I mean, we worked on Living Building Challenge buildings, but this is then the same thing for communities, and it's good to have a look at, even if it's just for inspiration.
Lovely. Now I've got a fantastic and challenging question here. I quite like these ones because it's kind of not right to always preach to have people that are converted with the questions. Now this is a great one. This says the UK construction industry is geared up for net zero. And then they go on to talk about some of the discussions in terms of the relative impact of greenhouse gases. And then it says, this is a one-page question, so bear with me. Yeah, bear with me. Then it goes on to say, we are pumping in tons of new man-made gases into our atmosphere, which will have an enormous global warming effect and stays in the atmosphere for 3,000 to 50,000 years. Now, basically, they're not enamored by the efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. Okay, let's make that point to you loud and clear. And so their question at the end is, what is the true global cost of this projected green electrical revolution? Now, to start you off, I would say that 98% of scientists say the reason why, in terms of the true impact and cost, is we're looking to protect the planet. We're looking to save the planet. But you may have a different view, so feel free to share your view.
I thought the question might have been getting at the sort of non-carbon greenhouse gases. Is that, have I sort of misread that?
No, because there's a lovely list of greenhouse gases, and they're all contained within the UN Framework Convention. So they are the greenhouse gases.
But I thought that the premise of the question was perhaps that not enough attention had been paid. That there's a lot of attention on carbon, but perhaps not as much on other greenhouse gases. Is that
Oh,
if I misread that?
No, precisely that. But when we're talking about net zero, it's covering everything. But you're correct, John. I think that's what they're getting at. So you go for it along that line. Go.
Well, my get out here is that I'm not a scientist, but I listen to what the scientists say. And the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, although we use carbon as a bit of a shorthand, and we often use CO2 with the little e equivalent as shorthand, but actually it does encompass all greenhouse gases, and things like land use change in agriculture are an absolutely essential component of that transition to net zero. So I think it is a serious issue. I'm not sure necessarily it's had quite the spotlight that carbon and energy has had.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'd just add to echo you, Kye, that the cost of inaction is much, much greater than the cost of action. So yes, there will be a big investment globally, but this will improve our lives and protect our future.
Lovely. And now I'm going to wrap up with a final question. Now, does the government and industry give clear, consistent messaging to the public? You see, I see lots of companies trying, as I'm certainly hearing today, but I'd like to see governments try harder, which I think was a point that was made earlier. Now, we have coronavirus briefings. Wouldn't it be good if we had, say, quarterly climate change briefings, something that updated the public on how their country is doing relative to other countries and to global targets. And you can tell I've thought this one through, because you could have on the panel Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough, Robert Doyle Bullard, who's the father of environmental justice, and a proper track and trace system that monitors progress on every property, new, old and retrofit. What, in terms of the situation, do you feel that perhaps governments could be clearer in their messaging to the public? And this is our final question.
I'll have a pop. I think yes, I think they could be clearer. I think it's as much about what is done as what is said, because actually what is said is there's typically quite a lot of good rhetoric, but and I'm again thinking of a UK perspective, but then that is then often contradicted by actions, and so one recent example would be in our recent comprehensive spending review, you know, a huge program of road building, for example, and kind of, you know, dwarfing some of the expenditure on something like retrofit. So I think, yeah, it's about, yeah, yes, messaging, but then practice what you preach.
You are what you do, not what you say. Excellent. Would anyone else hazard a go at that question?
Definitely, we could have more clarity on progress. I think we see a lot of, certainly we're all working in this field, so we see a lot in our inbox every day and it can be overwhelming. But how do we deliver kind of a mix of like the vision that we can have a better world and we can do this, and also you know, what is, as Greta Thunberg says, we need to act as if our house is on fire. So showing somehow showing progress, but not losing sight that if people think that it's too late, then that will doom things further. So there's a balancing act, I think, between pushing forward and going as far as we can.
Lovely. Did I hear a voice come in then? Okay, lovely. There being no further time for questions, we should thank our speakers in the usual way, and that time-honoured way. May I also thank you again for the stimulating excellence of the questions that were asked, and any questions that we were unable to get to, of course, we will provide answers in the coming days. Now, if you would like to know more about our green buildings and our green building work at the Chartered Institute of Building, just go to FutureLearn, and this website is www.futurelearn.com. We hope that you come along to our future CIOB conversations. They'll have great panels and will be well worth attending. So, ladies and gentlemen, we work hard at the Chartered Institute of Building to support and advise a progressive industry providing buildings, infrastructure and public realm, advancing on the challenges of building back better. Next slide, please. You can go to the Chartered Institute of Building Academy at www.ciobacademy, that's all one word, .org, to follow up on our leadership and sustainability training focused on making your companies more profitable and fit for purpose to meet current industry needs, and other great subjects like carbon neutral and energy efficient retrofits. So please, as individuals and organisations, don't get left behind. Go to the CIOB Academy. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. One slide before, sorry. That was my spare slide. Thank you. The CIOB Benevolent Fund provides a service to support our members that find themselves in difficult circumstances for reasons of hardship or mental health and not know where to turn. All inquiries are treated in complete confidence. Just go to www.ciobbenevolentfund, that's all one word, .org.uk. For those wishing to support their colleagues at this traditional season of goodwill to all women and men, you can donate to the Benevolent Fund at that same web address, ciobbenevolentfund.org.uk. Just click the donate button. I'd like to thank you for your generosity, and I'd also like to thank you for attending. From me, Kye Bangbola, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.